Good evening. I think the key point of the title of the lecture was that it was, or discussion, is connoisseurship and passionate art collecting. I think one of the biggest disappointments that I've seen over the last 20 years is that an awful lot of art buying is not passionate, or if it is passionate, it's passionate for the wrong reasons. And I hope this evening that we'll get a sense of what the true passion of buying art should be about, and tease out some of the more interesting stories along that journey for two of the collectors here today. So Kito, to kick off the proceedings, an easy question for one. How did you start buying art? And then a slightly sort of logical follow-on question. When did you feel that you'd gone beyond merely buying art to building a collection?
Is it working? Yeah. First of all, I'd just like to start by thanking Bunty and the Asia Society for organising this tonight. Thank you very much for that. And to Daddy Boer and Khorshid for hosting us. Thank you for doing that. How did we start collecting art? When Jane and I and the kids and Jonah is here arrived in India in end of 92, we knew very little about India and we knew absolutely nothing about Indian art. Our journey into India, when we first came here, we were sort of shocked and also mesmerized about this enormous, vibrant culture. And we were outsiders, wondering how on earth do we begin to decode what we were seeing, hearing, tasting, smelling. And we started on a journey of exploration. And what we saw was, you go to somewhere like Hampi and you see one of the greatest architectural sites on the planet. It's almost impossible to get to. It's even harder to stay there. And if you want to read something about it before you get there, good luck to you. At least that was the case in 1993. So there was this extraordinary culture. We found the same thing with music, with dance, with food. Everything was out there. It was all magnificent and new and puzzling. And when it came to art, the only reason we collected art is because you can actually collect art. You can't collect dance, you can't collect historic sites, and art was what we could do. And when we came here, we were blissfully ignorant. We didn't know a Hussein from a Gaitonde. And because of that, unburdened by knowledge, what we didn't do is we didn't look at the bottom left-hand side of every painting to see who the painter was. We just looked at the image and it either communicated something to us or puzzled us. And the first work we bought was a Ganesh pine, Woman Before the Pillar. It's in the book. It's one of the first images in the book. That was the start of our journey. It was at the Kumar Gallery in Delhi. And we were there at some drinks event like this, and I was talking to somebody, I don't even remember who it was, but I could never look at them in the eye because across the top left-hand shoulder was the woman from the pillar, and she was just looking at me, and I couldn't take my eyes off her. There's a magic power that work often has, an energetic power that comes through. But we didn't know pine. It's a bit of an odd painting. If you look at it, it's not one that immediately say is wonderful, but it had the same effect on Jane. And this work was a bit like a splinter in the brain. It was just sitting there teasing us. We'd talk about it. We'd go back to the gallery. We'd talk about it again. It seemed like a lot of money to us. And who was Ganesh pine? And there was no real logical reason for buying it, but we couldn't say no. And that was our first shot of heroin.
So it's not a very dissimilar story. I had just moved back after university, and accidentally my office was right in the heart of Kala Ghoda, and I had several friends at the time that used to sort of nudge me, and I would go into galleries and sort of just see what was going on. And I actually remember that my first purchase was a Badri Narayan from Pundole's. It must have cost me a few thousand rupees at the time. But it's a sort of a similar story. You know, you're sort of surrounded by it. You had a bunch of friends that had, you know, whose parents collected. My parents didn't really collect art, but had art all around them, very often gifted to them. And so there was, you know, a sense of osmosis that sort of came about. Very similar to Kito, very soon thereafter, you know, I was addicted.
This seems to be an ongoing theme when you speak to collectors, that it's likened to a disease or an addiction. In some senses, that sort of first hit is interesting, but what makes logical, rational professionals like yourselves go from buying one painting, two paintings, potentially 5 paintings to fill your walls, to going beyond that? Kito, you said that there was a sort of, in the book you mentioned a turning point with one particular painting that you felt was a sort of crunch moment in acquiring art, which was the Bruta, the triptych Traces of Man series. Can you sort of talk us through a little bit about that and how maybe you justified it?
When we started collecting, it was pretty easy to justify. We had a new house in Delhi, in Shantiniketan, and we had empty walls, and we needed to do something with it. So the rationalist consultant and me had my justification for doing this, and Jane never needed justification. She just had a great eye and a huge enthusiasm and a lot of passion for it. So I think we started off collecting in a way that we could easily justify it to ourselves. But there comes a time when a passion becomes obsession, and that is really when you've run out of wall space and you can't stop. And that is actually a difficult time. We said no to some works because we didn't know where to put them, and I deeply regretted some great Ramachandran's, early ones. And we just didn't know where they would go, so we said no. But one day Jane came back from one of her visits to the gallery, and she was really excited that she had seen this work by Bruta, Traces of Man 5, I think it is. And she said, Kito, you've got to go and see it. By that point, because I'd been traveling, it was about a week later, had gone back to Bruta's studio. And he knew that we were coming. I had never met him before, so he'd taken out these works. One's a triptych, I don't know how long it is, 8 meters or something? Yeah. Probably the size of the back wall, and there was a second one which is also very large, probably the size of one of those black walls there. And we walked in, and it was like somebody hitting you in the solar plexus. Just the power of this work, the energy and vibration that was coming out of it was, to us, quite extraordinary. We had absolutely no idea where we'd hang these walls. We had absolutely no idea how we'd pay for these works, because it was beyond our real means at the time, but we couldn't say no, and we ended up buying them. We didn't have anywhere to hang them, so they went into storage for a while, and shortly afterwards we moved to Dubai, and my job was to look for property in Dubai where we'd moved to, and I found one that I thought was right, and I phoned Jane up, who was in Delhi with the kids, and I said, Jane, I think I found the house. And the first thing she said was, does it have the wall? Does it have the wall? Because we'd had this work, we'd had it propped up, but it was never hung properly, and it did have the wall. That's why we rented that house, and we lived in that house for 15 years, because it had a brilliant wall. When we moved to the London house, Jane is a designer and redesigned the living room and designed the lighting and got a special artist who does art mixing of paints for palazzos in India because we had to have the perfect wall. And the perfect wall meant that it had to be something that showed the black work to its greatest effect, and the worst way to hang that actually is on a white wall. So a lot of thought went into what is the color matching for this work to make it really show its best. So this is a work that, you know, has shaped our life, not just our collecting life, but it's a milestone work, and it's been one we've been living with for the last 25 years.
Did you have a similar experience, or has your collecting been more?
Not really. So there was no defining work.
Right.
I think that in the early days of my collecting, it was always a question of limited means and unlimited wants. And so things would keep going on to a wait list as the means have sort of increased a little bit. That things yet go onto that wait list, but it's much easier to buy a lot more work than it was earlier on. But there hasn't been a defining work that has sort of tilted my collection one way or another. I mean, there's been a shift in the collection, which we can talk about later, but there hasn't been any defining work.
Okay. And Kito, when I look at your collection as a whole, you can see that a lot of the works within the collection are by well-known artists, but the works themselves are also a very unusual technique. So you've chosen works by Bruta with a scraped blade technique on canvas, Ganesh Pine's temperas, which are a tempera that was his own making. Even the Sousa pen and inks that you have included in the collection tend to be very intense, sort of fine works. The Jogen crosshatch technique, and probably I could continue through several other artists. Was that a conscious decision when you were buying the works, or was it almost a byproduct of what you liked?
It certainly wasn't conscious. In fact, you're the first person who drew our attention to that. I'd never really thought about it before, and you made us think more about that. I think what is certainly true is we believe that the greatest art has an energy and a vibration that connects at some level and communicates at some level, and a lot of that energy comes from the way that the artist engages with the work and invests him or herself in that work. And maybe with these complex techniques, that's them engaging for a long time. I mean, Bruta took those two works that we bought, which you described, took him 18 months to do those, of painstaking work. And a lot of his soul goes into that, and we feel that shows. So no, it was never an explicit choice, but I think it's a sign of the passion and engagement. And sometimes with contemporary, if I look at a Damien Hirst, all he's done is sign it, and it feels to me that it shows. And I guess there's nothing wrong with having a factory. That's part of what the modern world is about, but it doesn't ring our bell, I don't think.
And Akshay, would you admitted to me earlier that you had a very eclectic approach to acquiring works for the collection, and there was certainly not necessarily a sort of pre-planned model for collecting, and you said that certainly the jury was still out on whether it was the correct approach. But do you feel, despite the eclecticism, that there is a sort of central theme running through the collection?
So I'm like a kid in a candy store. I mean, I go in and I want to just basically get everything that I can sort of lay my eyes on. When we discussed, there isn't really a theme other than the fact that I've very clearly and consciously moved towards contemporary art. The focus of my collection is contemporary South Asian art, Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Nepali. But increasingly I'm moving outside of India as well. I'm sort of looking at different parts of the world. Generally tends to be developing countries, countries where there's an emerging art scene. So other than the fact that the theme is to be very focused on contemporary art, I don't really have a theme in my collecting. In my head, I don't know whether this is the right thing or the wrong thing, it's just the way I am. Lots of people would argue that my collection is very scattered. Eclectic is a very nice way of describing scattered. But that's really that's how I've been collecting. There's things that resonate to me. There's art that I equate with, and so that's just the way it is.
So in this sort of scattered approach, and both of you are now discussing buying art that wasn't necessarily you weren't necessarily brought up with, you weren't immediately aware of. And I believe it was Peggy Guggenheim who said, "I took advice from none but the best, and I listened. How I listened, that's how finally I became an expert." Kito, do you think it's true that you need advice of experts to buy art, or do you think it is a purely personal domain and that any acquisition is valid because it's a work of art, and if you respond to it, that's enough?
In India, there's this concept of rasa, which basically means that the work of an artist isn't over, and that can be music, dance, it doesn't have to be just plastic art, isn't over until it's elicited the desired response in the person who it's targeted at. And that always struck me as being quite an important concept. And it's important because it places a responsibility, at least in my interpretation, on three elements. First of all, it's the artist to have the technique and the ability to produce something that is moving. The second, that the receiver of that is sufficiently educated, cultured, sensitive, and has the attributes to be able to receive the message and interpret it and to be moved. And the third is the context in which it is hung. So we will say, and Jane will say most forcefully, the only thing that matters is that you love the work. But it's also important, I think, in the concept of rasa to understand that when Jane says you have to love the work, it's not puppy love. It's not just some sort of, ooh, I love that work. It's a nice color. It goes with my settee, which is valid, right? Why not? I mean, there should be no judgment. There should just be engagement. But I do think that there's an obligation in the process of creating as much rasa as possible to go through the process of educating yourself and trying to understand. Again, coming from outside of India, this is a deeply, deeply confusing culture. And the only thing that we knew is that the longer we lived in India, the less we understood it. And so you have to work really hard to understand what it is that artist at that time, it's 100 years, it's 1 billion people, it's there's a lot going on, and you have an obligation to understand it. And one of the great things about contemporary art is that it moves towards being conceptual. You can't possibly begin to understand it unless you do the work to understand the concept behind it. And I think the best example of that is Marcel Duchamp's Fountain, which is a urinal. And this urinal has been voted by many as being the most influential work of art in the 20th century because it created conceptual art. And I think it's great to understand rasa within that context. How do you, there's a urinal over there which I'm sure Pundoles will sell you at a very low price, but why does it, when it goes into the Museum of Modern Art in San Francisco, become the most important work because it creates rasa, because it is in a fantastic location. There was a brilliant idea behind it, and for you to engage with it, you have to force yourself to understand and go through the education behind that. And my only observation, and regret sometimes in India, is there's too much reverse fountain effect. Right? There are magnificent works in India which don't generate rasa because they're hidden. I personally think, and I think Jane shares this view, that one of the most important works of 20th century Indian art, its Guernica, is Ramachandran's Yayati. But who's seen it? Right? It was there at the NGMA for a short while during the Ramachandran retrospective. It's magnificent work. But how can it create rasa if you hide it?
So, Akshay, that's created quite a big question, but then how do you sort of respond to that as a...
Sure. So, personally, I've never really had an advisor or an expert. I mean, of course, sort of being connected with the art world, you have lots of friends, lots of gallerists, curators that you know, so you get, there's a lot of information that you get from them. But increasingly, I find that amongst my friends, young collectors, there's always a feeling of intimidation towards collecting art. They go into galleries, they're always a little wary about things. They don't know whether they're sort of, paying the right value for the art. They don't understand very often the meaning behind it. I mean, if we look at, like Kito was saying about, contemporary art tends to be a little more conceptual. Very often they don't understand it. So I see that there's no real harm in having an expert or a guide walk you through this. There's lots of people around who can sort of facilitate this process, and it's not as if it comes at a huge cost. So increasingly, I've been pushing some of my friends, younger collectors particularly, who are just getting initiated into collecting, to sort of use such guides to help them navigate the process, because it can be quite intimidating.
Jane and I just came back from the Kochi Biennale. We were there in January, where there's a lot of conceptual work, there's a lot of installations, and we were fortunate that we had a brilliant guide to take us there. And without somebody trying to explain what these artists are saying, you miss 80 to 90% of it. And time again, I'd get a bit bored and I'd rush off ahead and I'd walk into a room and I'd say, what's this, right? I mean, God, what are these young people doing? Joe and I could do better work than that. And I'd then walk out, and then the guide would come along and spend 5 to 10 minutes explaining what it was about. And then you would go in and, I was a rasa-free zone. 10 minutes later, I was beginning to generate rasa. I was beginning to understand. And that is so exciting when that happens. When you realize that you are limited by your ignorance, and all it takes is to listen, to learn, to hear, to reach out and to bridge, that feeling of rasa, that energy begins to form in you. And that is really the joy of collecting. And that's why we all need to take the time to study, to learn, and to listen to people like you, Rob.
Well, it's interesting that Kito, you are clearly an outsider within the Indian context, and you're talking 20 years later about Indian art with an Indian head. You're responding to questions about art that if we had the same conversation in London or New York, the majority of people in the audience would start to sort of glaze over with concepts of rasa. And do you think, as an outsider to Western art, Akshay, or to, in fact, other South Asian cultures, you have to start sort of building a resonance with that region to buy it, or can you just sort of go in blind and still have a valid response to it?
It's a very interesting question. To be perfectly honest, my approach to it has been I need to visit the country that I'm sort of buying art from. I'm sort of spending time with galleries. Inevitably, it involves a lot more research, a lot more time. I mean, it's not as easy as it is when you're buying Indian art because you tend to have a much better knowledge of what's going on. So it's not an easy process. For me, and this is very personal to me, it's linked to travel. It's linked to the ability to sort of spend time in that country, to sort of visit some of the contemporary art museums, galleries, talk to collectors that I know internationally that may sort of collect work from that particular region or that particular country. So it's a much tougher process, and just like I was mentioning that there are young Indian collectors who find it slightly intimidating. It has been slightly intimidating for me as well. I mean, I've had to spend much more time researching the works that I'm buying, the artists that I'm sort of following. Obviously, it has to be something that resonates with you. If it doesn't resonate with you, you don't look at it. I mean, the good thing is that it's so much easier in this in this digital age. I mean, pretty much everything is available on an Artsy app or an ArtNet app. There's enough ability to research things. Galleries are very, very forthcoming with information. I mean, I was recently in Hong Kong for Art Basel, and I was amazed at the speed at which you go into a booth and you're sort of looking at a particular work and you like it, and you're sort of discussing it with the gallerist, and before you reach your hotel at night, you've got 5 pages on the artist, on the artwork. So there's a lot there that's available. It's much easier than I'm presuming it was many years ago.
No, I think that's a very valid point. The sort of bombardment that you get today is good and bad. It allows you to see a lot more, but also it makes it potentially more of a minefield. What's interesting about the discussion that's come out this evening is that both of you are talking about how art resonates, how you're making references that are spiritual. I wouldn't necessarily say religious response to the art, but it's something that for two, dare I say it, male professionals who work in hard-nosed, rational businesses, what are you doing buying art? I mean, is it that art is just the get-out clause for the rest of your life, or does it in some way, and I'm not going to say what does it do for you, I'm going to say does it help your work? Kito.
I'd say first of all that when we started, and I really have to say this has been very much a joint journey. I happen to be up here because I talk
That was going to be my next question.
Okay, because I may be able to talk. Jane can see; she has the finer eye. When I think we started on this, our motivation was this is a way to engage with India, or one of the ways that was important for us to engage with India. We were accidental collectors. We never set out to have a collection. We're like a Seurat painting, a pointillist painting. 10, 15 years later, we discovered we've got about 1,000 works of art, and each is a single dot, and you then step back and say, what have we done, and then what have we got, right? And then a painting of all these dots begins to emerge, and you say, we've got a collection. That was never really the intent. So our intent when we set out was and continues to be, this is a point of engagement. And I have to say, we've left India 20 years ago. We continue to come back. We have an extraordinary group of friends, and all of those friends are related to the art world. I've did lots of clients, great clients who I enjoyed working with. Those, by and large, I haven't kept connection with, except for those clients who also connected. So I think we would have set out saying this is our way to engage. I think also I would have said early on this is a way for me to have a life other than my McKinsey life, and I think it's very important to have 2 to 3 lives. I don't think that I would have ever said that collecting would help me become a better consultant. And then one day, Jane showed me an article from some research they'd done. I think it was actually at Johns Hopkins University, at the medical school there, where they had two groups. One was a control group, and one where they were doing the experiment. And one of the control group of medical students was they gave them an art history course to do. Of course, in Johns Hopkins, they said, what on earth are we teaching medical students? Why are we wasting their time with art history? We want to make, and this is Johns Hopkins, we want to produce the best medical students and doctors in the world. Cut a long story short, at the end of it, they then did, they had a control group and they had the one that did the art history. And what did they find? They found that the students who'd had art history, were they better surgeons? No, they weren't. But were they better diagnosticians? Were they better able to build rapport with their patients and understand and go behind the artifice of how humans interact to understand what they were? They were better diagnosticians. And in many ways, being a consultant is a bit like being a doctor in the business world. And we spend a lot of time trying to diagnose people and get behind the mask. And what I have understood is that this whole art thing has made me a more complete human being because it literally engages the left-hand side and the right-hand side of the brain. It literally creates more synapses. But it also makes you come to terms with things which for me as a male, a Dutch person who studied computer science, who joined a consulting organization, are things that used to make me feel very uncomfortable. Things like gut and intuition, the things that we have spent in the West, much less than in India, 1,000 years denying in ourselves. And you have to come to terms with when you say that a piece of work has energy that connects with you. What the hell does that mean? How do I draw a McKinsey chart? How do I explain that to you? You can't. But it's there, it's important. And it is that recognition that there's much that goes on in life beyond the computer, beyond the chart, that's actually to do with much more energetic levels. That's what art helps you come to terms with. So 25 years and 1,000 works later, I have become a bit more like Jane, and that is a good thing.
Akshay, did you have anything to add to that? That was quite a
thorough response. But
collecting art has probably been detrimental to my practice, my legal practice. I have clients coming into the office and they see a lot of the work that's on the walls, which is not only mine but belongs to my partners as well. And the initial reaction is, we're obviously paying you too much. You need to lower your fees if you're buying all of this art. Not knowing that a lot of that art has been bought maybe 20, 25 years ago at a fraction of the cost of today's value. No, but jokes apart, I think for me, given the fact that my profession tends to be very, very, it can be very intense, it can be very one-dimensional in many ways. I think that collecting art, just like collecting other things, I collect books, for example, it sort of satisfies a lot of my intellectual needs. And with my collection, a lot of it is linked to things that I identify with, so a lot of my work is political, particularly the contemporary work is political.
And your books likewise are historical?
Yeah, historical. So there are things that, that sort of resonate with me intellectually. So there's that side of it as well.
Okay. And Kito, the question that I wanted to follow up on is building a collection as an individual is one process, and that's mind-boggling. Certainly, also having a wife and choosing what we even hang on our walls can cause pretty major arguments in our household. How have you built such a substantial collection together as a couple? Is it I buy one, you buy one, or is it a more sort of joint seeing of eye to eye?
I think in reality this has been a great marital adventure because it is, Jane would usually be at home looking after the kids in Delhi, and I would be off doing my work thing and gone a lot of the time. And our day jobs, or often our night jobs, were really quite separate. What art did was a shared passion which I think helped bring us together, and it was a shared journey, and we created lots of shared friends and memories throughout it. We fortunately, I think, have a similar taste, so I'd say 80% of the time there was no debate. I would say that in the early days I lost my way because I thought like a McKinsey person, and I had to have a purpose, I had to have a rationale, I had to have a story to tell other people. And Jane was always single-minded. She said, we just buy what we love, otherwise there's no point. And I said, no, we're going to do something on the art of history, and we need a section on Gandhi, and then I'd go off and buy 20 to 25 things about Gandhi, and at the end they say, well, why do we do that, right? I mean, interesting, but not much love. So the final answer is, why did we succeed? It's because I learned that basically I just listen to what Jane says. She will get upset because she says, no, you don't, but...
And Akshay, then the question that sort of follows on from all of this collecting is, what then? At some point, you have to start saying, well, we're not going to be around on the stage forever, and certainly not around in the world forever. So what does it mean to sort of build up this collection, and does it have a responsibility of handing it over to children, to institutions, to...
I mean, that's actually $1 million question. I don't really have an answer. I think I'm yet quite young, relatively speaking. My collection is quite young. I mean, I have a lot of work, but I don't think it's reached that level where it's sort of worthy of an institution in that sense. Clearly, as far as my books are concerned, I would like them to go to a library. Like I mentioned passingly, in addition to art, I collect books, and I actually sort of believe that my book collection is one that I could actually hand over to an institution or a library. As far as the art collection is concerned, I don't really know.
And in terms of books, increasingly as everything becomes sort of digital, what is it about actually collecting the physical book that still inspires you? Still,
the books that I collect. So my book collection is sort of predominantly Indian Raj books in English. So effectively from sort of the late 17th century to early 20th century. So I don't really think that there's a digital equivalent, quite frankly.
Right. So it is still about the quality of publication.
And I mean, the unfortunate bit about books is that books in India in particular haven't really survived because of climatic conditions. So there's not that much of it around.
Right. So it's also part of the challenge of acquiring.
Absolutely, and maintaining them as well.
Yeah. So, Kito, I'm going to ask you a slightly different question, which sort of starts to wind up our discussion. You've been collecting for 25 years. 10 years ago, we had a discussion about the first idea of doing a book. The book is finally published. Does that mean the collection is complete? What does it, why ever publish, or why stop, or what was the motivation for the book beyond the collection? If that's the right question, even. It may...
So, as I said earlier on, we were in a way accidental collectors. We never set out to do anything other than buy things that we liked. And what started to happen is we'd have people come around to our house and they'd want to see our paintings, and they'd go along and they'd want us to explain it. And if it was a Hussein or something, they would engage. But if it was a Chandrasekhar or something like that, there would be these, oh, who's that? Oh, it's a Chandrasekhar. And then there would be this sort of long, pregnant pause. And then they'd say, well, you really should do a book. Right? And that you should do a book was usually just a way to fill in awkward space because people didn't really know what to do with what you just told them. How do they relate to this work? It wasn't something that they really understood, and they were feeling a bit awkward and wanted to move on to the next topic. So this whole idea of, you should write a book always struck us as being a bit trivial. But then some people started saying, well, no, actually, you really should do a book. And so we took the first no regret step, which was we had it all photographed, and that was more than about 12 years ago, I think. We got Justin Pipager to fly in from the UK, and he spent, I think, 5 or 6 days doing all the work with Robin. And that we said, well, it was good anyhow. We needed to catalogue the collection, so why not do that? And then we said, okay, if we are going to do a book and we're going to charge, people $50, why would anybody? What are they going to get for that? I mean, how do you make it actually worthwhile? Because simply charging them $50 to see our collection is presumptuous, and that's actually a pretty appalling idea, really. So we had to find something that we felt had meaning and purpose. And where we landed up, and it took a number of full starts, we had the idea of calling the book The Art of History. What we realized what made our collection distinctive was simply that it covered 100 years of the 20th century in fair amount of depth and breadth. And if you looked at all those pointillist dots, what you actually saw was not just a collection of paintings and drawings. You actually saw the evolution of Indian culture and politics and sensibilities during a tumultuous 100 years. And you began to see that if you were an artist in 1910 in Bengal, you had some choices to make. Did you go down the oil painting Western route and the academic route? Did you go down and follow the Tagores down the route of going towards Japan and Asia? Did you go and do the work like the early Bengals, looking at the great culture and mysteries and myths of India? You look at the progressive, you just begin to see that each one of these groups represents a new milestone in thinking and self-identification for India. And that is what is exciting. And I think our insight was the story we needed to tell was not the story about our collection. It was that our collection happened to be a vehicle to be able to tell the story that is the really interesting story, which is, firstly, what actually was happening in India in the 20th century. What sort of choices and interpretations did some of the most talented and sensitive and thoughtful people in India at that time have to make, and why did they make that? So I think we felt that there was a story about India where our collection was simply a vehicle for that.
Excellent. I think probably now is the time to ask questions or from the audience, if anyone has any. Just one or two now, otherwise we will be having drinks afterwards, so I'm sure you can pick these two gentlemen's brains individually as well. So.
Hello. So my question would be about conceptual art. What would you say about the lack of responsibility that is given to the artist when it comes to conceptual and modern art, as appreciating conceptual art is not the easiest job? And yeah. So for example, when I was trying to understand The Bride by Marcel Duchamp, I had to refer to his notes, which gave me a better understanding of what the artist was trying to say through his painting, which otherwise would have been impossible for me to understand. So what would you say about that?
I mean, I think Kito kind of gave a good answer about his Kochi Biennale experience, right? So I think the only way you can understand conceptual art is by actually reading, researching, understanding the thought process of the artist. And that's probably one of the reasons why I like to collect contemporary art, because for me it's extremely important to be able to discuss with, to sort of meet artists, to discuss their thought process, to actually live and grow with that art. So I don't know whether I've answered your question, but I think that's the reason that I think it's very important for young collectors to collect. I mean, all art was contemporary at one stage, right? So I think it's important which is why for me it's very important to be able to sort of talk to artists, to engage with them, to understand the thought process behind the work. It's just it's a personal view. I'm not, like I said, I'm not sure if I've answered your question, but.
I don't think everyone can have that kind of access to the art.
No, but that's precisely my point. I think everybody can, and it's much easier when you're collecting younger artists, contemporary artists. I mean, most shows of young contemporary artists, the artists are there. You can sort of spend time, you can talk to them, and more often than not, they will engage with you.
Anyone else, or is it right at the back?
A couple of quick points. What do you think from your collection experience drives the demand for contemporary art? And how does, or rather the supply of contemporary art, and what do you think shapes that supply in terms of the demand, the people who buy art during the period of the 20th century that you've seen from the collections that you've got? The second point is there any such thing as Indian art as opposed to Pakistani art or Nepali art or Bangladeshi art? I ask that question specifically because to a large extent civilizational experience is quite similar. But have you found in your collections that there's a character which is different, there's a nature which is different, there's a sensibility that is different? Your reflections on that would be welcome.
Would you like to attempt the first one and I'll do the second?
Yes. So I think with respect to the questions about Pakistani, Bangladeshi, is art universal? I think is a valid question to which I don't really have the intellect to be able to answer. I know it's much debated. I personally feel that art reflects the culture and the ecosystem in which it was developed. And there is a risk that great art is a fine balance between a blandness of universality. Coca-Cola is universal. I'm not sure that that's really where we want art to be, but I think Koons is working hard to get there. And on the other hand, you have, native art can be so narrow as to be misunderstood or irrelevant for others. So somehow you try to find that way of being able to reflect your culture but speak to many. And I think that is what I think many great artists like the Guy Tondes managed to do. About Pakistan and Bangladesh versus India, I'm really going to defer to Akshay, who I think is more active in that, but I'll give you one point of view. Something happened in the early 21st century in India around the business system and the business model of contemporary art, which I personally feel has eroded a lot of spirit, and that spirit still exists in Pakistan and India, which is money is not the primary driver. You have people out there where you are living in a culture which was normal, I think, in the 20th century in India, where to be an artist was not particularly respected. And the only reason you became an artist was because you were passionate and you're driven, you could do nothing else. And you became an artist despite what your marriage prospects would be, despite what your parents wanted you to do, because you had no choice. And the difference between a diamond and a lump of coal is just heat and pressure. And the more heat and pressure there is in a society, that's why Iran continues to produce great work, because there's a lot of heat and pressure in there. And there was a time for a decade when this was you either became, well, no, I'm not going to say that's unfair, but, being a contemporary artist was a good business opportunity, and that ran the risk of corrupting, in my view, some sensibilities. I think there's a lot of correction that's going on because there is a lot of great contemporary work being done in India, but I think that there is a duty on the part of gallerists to control avarice, and to support an artist is also to support them during their dark phases, which all of them have. And I'm not sure that patience and maturity existed in 2005 to 2008.
Just on the commonality between, say, Pakistani, Bangladeshi, and Indian art, I think the answer is there's a yes and a no. So really, it isn't one size fits all. If you look at a lot of the contemporary Indian, Pakistani, Bangladeshi art, it can be very similar. But then there's also, you also see lots of differences with artists who, for example, are very political, who are sort of resonating with political themes of their time. And, particularly when you sort of start moving away from traditional forms of art like sort of painting, and you sort of move towards things like video. So if you take Bangladeshi artists, for example, a lot of their political themes are quite different from some of the political themes that you have Indian artists producing or Pakistani artists producing. Also, artists that get very influenced by tribal art. So, I think that tribal art, the Indian contemporary artists that are using tribal sort of influences in their work is not something that you would necessarily find in Bangladesh, or you would find in Pakistan, for example.
If I could just mention something about Indian artists, it seems that every contemporary art discussion we have is it a valid point to be discussing what it means to be an Indian artist? We're sitting in a room today surrounded by Nandlal Bose paintings, and I think it's a very relevant point that in 1930, Nandlal Bose produced the woodblock of Gandhi on the wall over there that was for the Dandi March. It was a very tumultuous time in India. It was a tumultuous time in the rest of the world. And I think it is relevant to the artists of that moment to discuss what it meant to be an Indian artist. I think potentially the problem is that there's been almost an ongoing time lag of that discussion for the next 100 years, which even in 1921, Rabindranath Tagore said, don't be herded like cattle to be Indian artists. It was something that he sort of was very clear about. So I think this question of Indian versus non-Indian or is still relevant, but almost it was more relevant then than it is now for Indian artists, but it may be equally valid for Bangladeshi or African artists of different nations today. And that's something that sort of is very typical of art movements, that you suddenly see how they evolve in similar cycles at different moments in time in the world. But I think that's a whole different discussion, so maybe it's time to have a drink and discuss it informally. Dalibar, are you...